Well, good evening, Lakesiders. How are you doing this today? I'm John Mann, Director of Education for Lakeside, and for this evening's historic portrayal is Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells Barnett was an ardent advocate of African American civil rights, women's rights, and economic rights. Throughout her life, she maintained a fearless devotion to justice, which often placed her in a physical danger and social isolation. As a journalist and activist, Ida B. Wells Barnett made an undeniable mark on history by speaking out against the lies that were at the root of racism and sexist beliefs in America. Her campaigns, speeches, books, letters, news articles, and social work all focused on this theme: freedom, justice, and equality for all Americans.
Oh, thank you very much. You're very kind. You know, I had such an awful experience when I was a young woman, just 21 years old, dealing with the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad, that I vowed I would never come to Ohio. However, I have been warmly received, and I am very appreciative to be here this evening to speak with you. I see we have some young children in the audience. Are they? Yes? Yes. Well, I pray that you will excuse some of the things that I'm going to say. I will be as delicate as I can. But history, unfortunately, when you speak the truth, is not always pleasant. So please bear with me and understand that I'm sharing with you the work that is my life's work, which started on the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad in 1884. I was a teacher, and I was living in Memphis, but the little colored school that I taught at, because the schools were segregated, the white children went to school in Memphis, but the colored school was in Woodstock, and so I took the train. Now, I was accustomed to buying a ticket for the ladies' car, the first class ticket, and before this particular day, there had never been a problem. However, this day, I was sitting in the ladies' car, and the conductor came by and said, "You're going to have to go to the smoking car. That's where your people sit." And I informed him that I had purchased a ticket for the ladies' car, and since I was sitting here, I didn't feel the need to move. Whereupon he decided he was going to put his hands on me. Well, I saw him reach for me, and I grabbed the seat in front of me and braced my feet against the seat so that he would not be able to remove me. But as he kept pulling, I sank my teeth into his hand. Now, that did not deter him for long. He returned with 3 other conductors and some of the men on the car, and they forcibly threw me from the train along with my bag. That wasn't the worst of it for me, though. For that one man to have that feeling that I did not deserve to sit in the ladies' car was bad enough. But the entire car of passengers clapped and applauded when I was thrown from the train. I was not one to suffer fools gladly. I suppose that's because of my upbringing. My parents were very fierce defenders of what they thought was right and what they thought was true. When I was born in 1862, I actually was born into slavery right in the middle of the Civil War. Thank God when it ended in 1865, I had no knowledge of it, but I heard the stories. My father was a product of a union between a slave owner and his enslaved servant woman. That made him a mulatto, and his father was decent enough to trade him in a trade and teach him to read and write, but he was still enslaved. My poor mother had come from Virginia as a slave, as a child with her sister. She was one of 10 children, but after she was sold down the river to Mississippi, she never saw her family again, even though she looked and looked until the day she died. But they had a fierce determination in them. Once slavery was over, as did the entire community there in Holly Springs, Mississippi, to become citizens of this country that they had worked and slaved literally for free for so many years to now enjoy a life and a family and an occupation and citizenship in this country. And so my father became a Republican, the party of Lincoln, and he became a Republican leader, and he was a Mason. And my mother, God bless her, though she was illiterate, when the lovely young Yankees, who we were told, I remember this when I was small, that the Yankees were going to come south and eat us. That's what they told us. That's what the slave owners told us, but we knew better. And so when these lovely missionaries, men and women from the North, came and opened schools for us, I thought, truly, we will be able to live together in a society and put the past behind us. These white teachers and ministers are showing us Christian love and values by coming here and opening the doors of knowledge to us. During slavery, my parents weren't allowed to be married legally. It was prohibited. And at any time, your family could be separated. So one of the first things they did, and many families did, was to get married. And I was their first child. And I've already told you about the incident on the train. It started before that. I was fortunate, as I said, that these missionaries had come from the North to teach us. And if you could have seen us, we were so eager to learn. And my mother would come to school with me. She would get up early in the morning and complete all of her chores so she could come and learn to read and write the Bible. And she was so proud when she finally could do that. Now, since I was the oldest, one after the other, I had little brothers and sisters. And you know how it is when you're the oldest sister. You're in charge. And so I was the eldest, and I went to school, and I got into a discussion with the director of the school, and we had a disagreement about things that were being done, and I spoke my mind, and I was summarily dismissed. Well, no matter. I stayed at home and tutored my younger brothers and sisters because they weren't old enough to go to school. My father knew that I was headstrong, but he didn't discourage me. He said, you have a mind, and you love to read, and you love to tell stories. You have a future ahead of you. Oh, would that have been the truth. Little by little, the gains that we had achieved, electing for the first time members of our race to Congress and to positions in the government, to the Senate even. We were so proud to have Blanche Kelso Bruce be elected to the Congress for Mississippi. But little by little, a campaign of brutality and oppression began in the South to take away those gains that were so dearly earned through the Civil War and all the bloodshed and all the suffering. The group that formed in the South called the Ku Klux Klan began intimidating people, burning down the schools that the missionaries had built for us, running the teachers out of town. Gradually, it got to the point where you really were risking your life just to cast a ballot, especially if you voted Republican because the South had gone Democrat. Well, I saw how staunchly my father refused to let anyone intimidate him. He lost his job because he refused to vote Democratic. Fortunately, he was trained as a carpenter, and so he was able to own his own business. But many in our community suffered, and there was quite a lot of intimidation and threats. I don't know what would have happened if I had stayed in Mississippi, but as fate would have it, when I was visiting my grandmother on her farm, I received a letter from home saying that a yellow fever epidemic had broken out, and people were dying every single day. And I said, well, the letter must be to tell me that Mother and Father are coming to join me here. No, the letter was to tell me that they had stayed behind to care for the sick, which they always did. They always had their door open to anyone in need. And within 24 hours, both my mother and father perished from that yellow fever. I was 16 years old, and my whole world changed with that letter. My grandmother begged me not to return, but I had to go back. My little brothers and sisters were there. And when I arrived, because my father was a Mason, his brothers were there from the organization, and my mother's friends, who had been her church-going friends, were all there, and they said, now, Ida, don't you worry about a thing. We have decided that we're going to take your brothers and sisters, and each of us will take one of them and adapt them into our family, and you don't have to worry about anything. Well, I listened. And when they were finished, I said, no, that's not going to happen. My mother and father would turn over in their graves if they knew our family was separated. I remember those stories my mother told about wishing that she knew where her brothers and sisters were. They said, well, Ida, how can you stay together? You're just a little girl. I said, I will find a way. So I took one of my mother's skirts, which was longer than my skirt that I was wearing because I was just a child, and I put my hair up, and I went out looking for a job. And I got a job 6 miles from home as a teacher. And so as my grandmother came to stay with the children, every Sunday I would get on my little mule and ride 6 miles to teach school, and then on the weekend I would come home and do all the chores, wash the clothes, and prepare meals that the children could have while I was gone. And we carried on like that for 2 years. I took care of them. Well, my mother's sister, Fanny, in Memphis, realized how we were struggling, and so she offered to have us come and move in with her. Oh my goodness. Now, you know, Holly Springs is a real country town, but Memphis, that was an exotic metropolis to my mind. Oh, it was the center of commerce in the South, and so it was a big city with beautiful homes and schools and a community of people of my race who were educated, doctors and lawyers and business people. And I said, yes, this is where I want to be. And that's when I started writing in my diary, because I had so many thoughts that I couldn't share with anyone else, being an orphan at 16. And I wrote, I enjoy this. I enjoy going to lectures and concerts and listening to people debate. I think I would like to be a writer. And I began writing little articles for the bulletin in church about things that were going on, and people encouraged me. So I submitted pieces, and I didn't use my real name because I was too shy, and I was a new person in town and wasn't sure how I would be received. I signed them Iola, and I started writing about things that happened to me. But when I got arrested on that train in 1884, that's when I really decided I was going to start writing and sending my stories out to the newspaper, because that was an injustice that I was not going to take lying down. I sued the railroad, and I won. And I had such hope. Thank you. Well, don't clap yet. I had such high hopes because little by little, the policy of separate but equal, which it was not, I didn't want to sit in the smoking car. Do you know what was going on in the smoking car? Gambling, drinking, men making lewd remarks to the women that had suffered through that. Who wants to show up at work reeking of tobacco and brandy and God knows what else? So I sued, and I won. And I thought, this is a real step forward for us. If we stand up for ourselves, this country is a country of law. And the Constitution says that now we are citizens and will be treated as citizens. But the railroad company appealed to the Supreme Court of Tennessee. And, well, I'll tell you what the newspaper said. Darky damsel loses case. Court says that she was not a sincere seeker of justice, but a troublemaker, as the accommodations were sufficient for her and she needn't have sued. I was so disappointed. I had such high hopes for this, and my heart was so grieved that I just wanted to gather my whole race in my arms and just fly away, because clearly the law was not meant to be enforced equally. But that was the beginning of my writing in earnest. If I saw something in Memphis or heard something that was happening somewhere else, I wrote about it even though it wasn't something polite for a lady to discuss. One of the things I wrote about was the fact that the colored school there in Memphis, because now I was teaching in Memphis, they had opened a school, had inferior housing, had inferior materials, one teacher for all the grades sometimes, whereas the school for the other children was a brick building with glass windows and teachers for every grade and a library and a gymnasium. Well, I wrote about that and I said it wasn't fair, let alone the fact that we were paid $40 a month and the other teachers were paid $80. Well, apparently that didn't sit well with the Board of Education, and so they fired me. I became a writer in earnest at that point. I had no choice. So I went about, again on a little mule that I rode side saddle, and got subscriptions for my newspaper. And it tripled. And the owner of the newspaper was so impressed that he let me buy part interest in the newspaper. And now I began to really address things that I thought were wrong. Now, I was out of town interviewing somebody for an article that I was going to write coming up. And when I returned, I found out that my best friend, the best friends I had there in Memphis, because as I told you, I was a newcomer, and being strong-willed and forceful, I wasn't always welcome in every circle. His name was Tom Moss, and he and his friends, Calvin and James, had opened a grocery store. And it was doing well. Tom Moss was a model citizen. He was a postman, he owned his own home, and he had worked hard and saved with these other men to open this grocery store in the colored section of town, because the white grocery store charged more for colored patrons, and the quality of the food was inferior. Well, this didn't sit well with him, and so they began an uneasy alliance until finally the other store owner had had enough, and he complained that my friend Tom was selling beer and that people were loitering, and it was an unwholesome atmosphere at the store. So without any investigation on the law's part, they deputized this man and a whole militia to come and arrest Tom and the other men. They came at night with no badges, no uniforms on, and Tom and Calvin and James got their guns and defended themselves, because there was no arrest, there was no explanation of what was happening. Well, one of the white deputies was shot, and when word spread about that, the entire male population of Nashville picked up their arms and gathered around the courthouse because they had arrested Tom and Calvin and James. They also declared that no one colored could have a gun, and they collected all of those guns. And so our community was helpless against this onslaught. Now, while they were in the jail, this deputized mob broke into the courthouse, took them out of the jail, took them into the woods, and murdered them. Tom's wife was my best friend, and she was expecting a child. In the newspaper, the white newspaper, they explained that Tom had begged for his life for the sake of his wife and his unborn child, and that his last words were, "Tell my people to go west, for there is no justice for them here." My next editorial in the paper was one where I indeed said, yes, go west, go to Nebraska, go to Oklahoma, because it's clear that there is no law in this city that will stand up for the rights of our people. 6,000 people left Memphis in the next 6 months. Well, the business owners came to me and asked me, what could I do with the paper to discourage them from leaving, because they were losing money with people leaving. They didn't have employees and they didn't have customers. that just made me redouble my efforts. And so I wrote in the paper that they should boycott the streetcar because it was segregated. And so the streetcar began to lose money. So they came back to me again and said, why do you suppose the coloreds aren't riding the streetcar? And I said, I don't know. Why do you think they're not riding? And they said, well, we hear tell that Negroes are afraid of electricity. And I said, do tell. And I wrote another editorial and said, keep on boycotting the streetcar until our rights are observed. Now, I have to tell you, like many people, I thought that lynching only happened when some heinous crime had been committed. I thought that it was brutal and unlawful, but maybe justified because of men doing untoward things to women, and I'll leave it at that, and you can understand what I'm saying. But when Tom and Calvin and James were lynched, that made me realize it wasn't about preserving women's honor or licentious behavior or any of the things that they used as an excuse to drag our men from their homes and take their lives. And so I decided I was going to go and talk to people and read the articles and find out what was really at the root of this horrible wave of violence that was afflicting us. I interviewed hundreds of people. I gathered hundreds of articles because at this time, lynching was accepted, so they would write about it in the newspaper. In fact, sometimes it was announced in the newspaper that there was going to be a lynching, so people could come from out of town to see it. Oh, they would take pictures and they would take souvenirs afterwards. It was a public spectacle, and it was totally accepted. In fact, sometimes the sheriff and the police and the mayor would be present at the time, taking pictures. So it wasn't hard for me to get the information, since it wasn't being hidden. And what I found out was, it was because now that the South had lost the free labor of the black slave, there was competition for jobs and competition for work. And in many towns where the colored population far outnumbered the white population, there was fear that they would take over. We had the vote and we were electing officials, and it was just too much for them to accept, especially since the cotton crop had failed and there was poverty. And it was this horrible combination of factors that led to this violence. It wasn't because of crimes being committed by men, and sometimes even women and children were subject to this horror. So I printed that in my paper. And I printed that it was all a lie, that I will spare you because of the children. But I printed it, and let's just say it was inflammatory. So much so that while I was away, they wrote an article in the paper and said that whoever the brute is, because they couldn't believe that a woman had written this, so they said the brute should be taken to the town square and branded and given surgery with lamb shears. And so I realized that there was a price on my head. Not only did they write this in the paper, but they burned my printing press to the ground and put a price on my head. So now I had lost everything. Fortunately, I was out of town when that happened, and I was making my way to New York. Well, when I arrived there, I met Thomas Fortune, who ran the New York Age, the largest colored paper in the country. And he said, Miss Wells, I've been reading your stories. We reprint them in our paper, and I want to offer you a job writing here. So I continued my work, and I published it in a book called Southern Horrors, The Truth About Lynching. Again, there was a backlash. My name was dragged through the mud. I was scandalized. I can't even begin to tell you the things that were said. It was so horrendous that I had to hire a lawyer to defend me. Mr. Fortune suggested that I go to Chicago for the 1892 World's Fair. and write about that, because nowhere in the entire fair was there any mention of what our people had done to build this country and how we had come out of slavery and gotten educated and started schools and businesses. Nothing. The only exhibit that they had there with Negroes was a woman named Nancy Green, who was dressed as a mammy and selling pancakes. So Ferdinand Barnett and Frederick Douglass, you do know Frederick Douglass. So blessed to have him as a friend. He took me under his wing because he knew I was an exile from my home and struggling and being slandered in the paper. Well, the three of us wrote this pamphlet about, it was called Why the Negro is Not in the Color, Why the Negro is Not Participating in the Columbia Exposition. And I gave out 20,000 copies of it. 20,000 copies. And that created more hub about this woman and the things she's saying, and it can't be true, and she's a liar. And so I hired Ferdinand, who was a lawyer, lawyer, sometimes both. It was a criminal attorney. He was the first black man to pass the bar in Illinois, and he had a thriving business, but he also had a newspaper, the first colored newspaper in Chicago. And so I hired him to defend me, and I had made up my mind many years before. By this time, I was 30 years old. Now, don't you tell anyone that. Which was considered an old maid, to be certain. But I had decided many years ago that I would not fawn before a man and flirt with him and see who I thought was attractive and then throw myself at him and hope to be married. No, I wanted a man with character and strength and fortitude like my father. And that was Ferdinand. He had done the same things I'd done with his newspaper. He'd been sued because he said, if this country doesn't recognize the rights of the black man, the flag is nothing but a dirty rag. Well, you can imagine the response that got. But he kept at it, and I admired him for that. And so we got married. And I bought the newspaper from him. I didn't change my name. I just changed it to Ida B. Wells Barnett. One of the first women to do that. I said, I'm not taking his name. We're joining together. We're partners. Well, as you can imagine, this was the 1890s, and lynching had become a national disgrace and also a national secret because people, again, believed that it happened because it was justifiable. So I was invited to England by a Quaker woman who was in the peace movement there. And she wanted to let the English know what was happening in America. And so I sailed across to England, and I lectured, and I showed the horrendous pictures, and I read the horrific accounts, firsthand accounts of what people are saying about what happened. And when I came back, there was a newspaper run by a man named Harlan, a white man, who wrote Ida's experiences abroad. And I was so touched that he would take it upon himself to spread this information, because the Negro newspapers were always publishing it, but it was the broader audience that we needed to understand that these things were happening because they were not aware of it. And the Southern papers denied it. They said that I was lying. And so he and a man named Charles Aiken, who was a minister, came from England to America. And when he arrived, what did he read the first day he arrived here but a lynching in Kentucky? And he said, I didn't want to believe that it was true when I heard about it, but you were right. And so he joined with me. And so our first two children were named Harlan and Charles after these two amazing men who did not see color but saw justice and injustice. Well, my good friend, Susan B. Anthony, you know who she is. Yes. She got me interested in the suffrage movement. As I said, one of the heartbreaking things about Reconstruction after the Civil War was that just as soon as we got our rights and we were voting and electing officials and changing the laws, once the Army left the South, things fell into a worse situation. And that meant that the black man lost his right to vote. They had poll taxes and grandfather clauses and writing tests that you had to pass. Or they simply sometimes would just stand there with guns and dare you to try to vote. And so she encouraged me to understand that it wasn't just men that needed to vote, black men, but women did too. And I said, listen, you're not telling me anything I don't know. I was born a black woman. I know we need our rights. And so I began to agitate in Chicago, and I formed a suffrage club. And do you know that before women's suffrage was passed in 1920, because of the agitation of black and white women in Illinois, women voted in state elections in 1913. And I registered over 10,000 black voters to vote in that first election, black and white. I kept busy. I think I was the only woman in America traveling and lecturing with a nursing baby. I'll never forget, after my fourth child, sitting at the table and reading about this horrendous riot in Springfield, Illinois, and thinking, oh, this is terrible. And Ferdinand was discussing it with me, and the children said, well, Mother, why are you sitting here? You have to go. So off I went to interview the people who were eyewitnesses, because the paper was saying that a rowdy group of Negro boys had started this riot, and that the white men were defending their homes and their women. And the fact is that it was just a powder keg that had been building, because more and more blacks were moving from the South, and it was creating tension, especially in smaller towns. And this riot lasted for 3 or 4 days, and hundreds of people were killed. So I stayed busy. One of my proudest moments was working with the suffragists and getting women to vote and getting black women organized all over the country in an organization called the National Colored Women's Association. Our job, especially since we were educated and we were able to, was to welcome the Southerners who were escaping the horrors of the South, because when they arrived north, they still found housing discrimination, they still found difficulty getting jobs, and they weren't educated. So moving to the city was really, really hard for them. So we started settlement houses and employment offices and recreational facilities so that they wouldn't be gambling and going to pool halls and debasing themselves. When people move from the country to the city, sometimes they're so dazzled by what's available to them, they fall into things that are not in their best interest. In 1919, when the women of the country decided they were going to march in Washington, D.C., I was in the Illinois delegation. Well, there was, as you may know, a debate about whether or not black women should be allowed to be in the movement, because they didn't want to offend the women of the South, because if they didn't have their support, they wouldn't be able to get the amendment passed. And so there was a discussion in the group that I was in Chicago as to whether I should be allowed to march or not. And they said, well, you understand, don't you? And I said, no. They wanted us to march in the back of the parade. That was the concession they were willing to make. I said, if I don't march with the Illinois delegation, I'm not going to march at all. Well, they wrote letters back and forth to the South, and it was decided that I could not march. The day of the march, I was in Washington, D.C. My delegation came up. I stepped out of the crowd and marched right along with them. I made a lot of enemies because of my staunch belief in standing up for what is right. There was a riot in Texas where the soldiers were in a small town, and they were so abused by the people there that they took guns and marched on the city. They hung 12 of them and court-martialed the rest of them. I thought that it was a crime. And so I passed out buttons supporting them, saying, these lives matter. These men were in uniform and they were mistreated by their own government. Their lives matter. Well, I was at home one day and a knock came to the door and I opened it and there were two gentlemen who said they were from the Secret Service. And they said that they wanted me to stop passing out those buttons. And I said, why? And they said, because you are accusing the government of doing something wrong. That is treasonous. And I said, I think that it was a disgrace to kill those men and put them in a mass grave like they were dogs. And if that means that I'm treasonous, then so be it. And I slammed the door. They didn't come back. I did not suffer fools gladly. Because of this, I lost my passport and I wasn't able to go to Paris for the Pan-African Convention. I was deemed a radical and an anarchist. But I was one of the original formers of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, along with Mary Church Terrell and Jane Addams and William E.B. Du Bois. So much work to do. So much work to do. But what was at the root of it all was taking the time to go and find out the facts and shine the light of truth on them. Because when people don't know the truth, they can't make decisions that are fair or just or true. That was my crusade, to find the facts and shine the light of truth on them. I've taken up enough of your time. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
In 1929, at the age of 68, Ida was still growing strong. She ran for a seat in the Illinois State Senate as an independent, but was not elected. She began working on her autobiography entitled Crusade for Justice, but died on March 25, 1931, before it was completed. Her daughter, Alfreda, published it in 1970. To date, Ida B. Wells Barnett's memory has been honored, her introduction into the National Women's Hall of Fame in 1988, and by a commemorative stamp issued by the U.S. Postal Service on February 1st, 1990, as part of her Black Heritage Series. The Ida B. Wells Memorial Foundation and the Ida B. Wells Museum have also been established to protect, preserve, and promote Wells's legacy. In her hometown of Holly Springs, Mississippi, there is an Ida B. Wells Barnett Museum in her honor that acts as a cultural center for African American history. In July of 2018, Chicago's City Council officially renamed Congress Parkway to Ida B. Wells Drive. It is the first downtown Chicago street named for a woman of color.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Ida B. Wells is one of my idols. She was a bad girl. Like John Lewis said, she got into good trouble. And she never backed down from a fight. Not even from the time she was in school and she got expelled all the way up to her dying day. There is now also a statue of her in Chicago that took a long time, but they raised the money and there's a statue of her now. So that is some of Ida's story. I had to edit it because of the age of some of the members of our audience. And really, I don't like to recount those lurid details anyway. They're heartbreaking, and they are a horror story. But it happened, and to pretend that it didn't doesn't serve anyone. My name is Sherry Tolliver, and I'm a member of a group, Women in History. I think some of you have seen other performers from our group. This is a labor of love. I would love to answer any questions you might have about something that I spoke about, or about our group, or whatever if you have a comment, please feel free to to speak up? If nobody asks, I'm going to have a pop quiz. So, yes, sir.
Do you have any information about what happened to all of her younger brothers and sisters?
No, I do not. I know one of her sisters was crippled, and I think she died young. That is a good question. No, I don't. I know what happened to her children, but not her brothers and sisters. That's a good question.
I'll ask another question.
Okay.
How much additional traveling did she do? Did she go to the West Coast at all, or to New England? Or?
No, she wasn't. Well, once she got run out of the South, she didn't go back until 30 years later. And I got to tell you that story real quick. The cotton farmers in Arkansas were trying to unionize because they were forced to sell their cotton at a lower price than the white farmers. Well, they were accused of sedition and trying to overthrow the government, and convicted of treason or whatever it was, sedition, and they were on death row. They were going to be hung. And so word got to her, and she made herself as, inconspicuous as possible, went back to the South, got taken into the jail. The men explained what happened to them, that they had been forced to confess because they were tortured. And she said they sang and said that they were, ready to die, and they were willing, that they weren't afraid. And she said, all you've talked about since I got here is you're willing to die, you're not afraid to die, and you're going to forgive your enemies. Why not talk about living? The last thing you need to be doing is thinking about dying. If you believe in the living God, then ask him to spare your lives and believe that he will. And I thought that was so powerful. Well, she went back and she wrote the story, and all the charges were dismissed. That is the power of a pen in the hands of somebody who's devoted. So that's, okay, you had another question. I'm sorry. I just wanted to share that story.
Well, I can ask more, but
okay.
I'm sure others have questions as well.
Okay.
Could you tell us what did happen to her children?
Oh, yes. One of her sons became a lawyer. Ferdinand had 2 children before they were married, so Ferdinand was a lawyer, but also Charles, I believe, became a lawyer, and I always mispronounce the guy's name. It's a German name. He worked for the government like as an attorney general's office or something. And then her daughter she named her daughter Ida B. Wells Jr. Do you love it? And then their youngest daughter was Elfrida, and Elfrida is the one that compiled her autobiography and published it in 1970. And she's also written a children's book about her, and she's been in the news in the past few years because she's still promoting. She was responsible for getting the statue finally built, her effort. So they, carried on her legacy. They didn't go out and do what she did, but they were educated, and they said she was a hard mother. She wanted them to strive, and so they kind of stayed in the shadows just because she was always in the limelight and always, catching flack for it. So yeah, but they all were successful. Mm-hmm. Oh, there's a question over here. And, oh, this lady right here. Yeah. Oh, the babies.
Do you have any stories about her speaking in churches and how she was received or not received as a woman speaking in churches?
Good question. Normally, because she was so good at organizing women, she didn't have to speak to men that much. She got the women together, but then even with them, there was power struggles and things because she was so uncompromising. But she did get pushback because she was a woman, especially in the South, where they felt like she was not staying in a woman's place. And this was the black ministers who thought, she was getting too big for her pantaloons. But water off a duck's back, she just kept doing what she did. But yeah, in fact, her biggest conflict at first was with Booker T. Washington, because he was an accommodationist, and she wanted, the lynching law to be enacted, anti-lynching law, and Holland, the German man, was the publisher of a newspaper in Chicago that I told you she named her son after. He was close friends with 7 different presidents, I think. And I don't know this for a fact, but I believe he was the reason she got to go to President McKinley and talk to him about doing something about lynching. And Booker T. Washington was very upset about that because he had garnered favor with them, and he was, you know, garnering monetary support by being an accommodationist. And she said, if he doesn't do anything about it, he's a coward. Well, you can't say that about the president, but she did. So yeah, she got pushback. She got pushback. And she alienated a lot of people because she was so adamant about what she thought was right. There's a price to be paid. Yes.
What other characters do you portray?
Okay. I do Katherine Johnson, who was in the Hidden Figures movie, the mathematician. What an amazing life. The movie doesn't even scrape the surface of what her life story. I do Rosa Parks, who is my personal saint. I do, well, I used to do, I'm too old to do her now because she died when she was 33. Bessie Coleman, the first black woman to get a pilot's license. And as it turns out, Ida B. Wells read her eulogy at her funeral because she was based in Chicago. Yeah, those are a few. I do some Cleveland characters. Eliza Bryant, who started a nursing home for the colored aged, because even in Cleveland and Ohio, things were segregated all the way up to the 50s. They just didn't have signs over the door. I do Elizabeth Keckley, who was the seamstress who worked for Mary Todd Lincoln and also had her own business where she hired 20 other seamstresses and taught them her own method of dressmaking. She was born a slave, again, an incredible life story in Washington, D.C. Those are a few of the characters I do. This gentleman has a question. Done that way. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I just was going to ask, what is your background?
This is what you call, what is it? Synchronicity, because my 2 favorite things are theater and history. And so when I found out about this group, it was just, you know, I've been in the group 30 years. So when I started, I could do Bessie. Oh, and I do Wilma Rudolph, too, the Olympic champion that was born, that had polio, and they thought she'd never walk. Okay, somebody else has it.
I was just thinking about the fact that Ida Wells was a public voice.
Mm-hmm.
So if you channel your inner Ida B. Wells and you think about sort of public voices,
Mm-hmm.
maybe specifically around race today,
Mm-hmm.
who are some of the people that you think she might align with?
I can't think of her name, but the woman in Georgia that's a writer and an activist that really pushed the vote. Oh, what's her name? Stacey Abrams. Yeah, her. Nicole, I can't think of her whole name either, but she worked for the New York Times and she wrote the 1619 Project. And then when she joined the journalism school at Howard University, it's now called the Ida B. Wells School of Journalism. So that's another honor that she had, and it's specifically investigative reporting. I think of Brian, oh, I can't think of anybody's name, that started the social justice. Yes, Brian Stevenson, yes, him. And there's another woman that I do that her name was Charlotta Bass, who was a journalist in California, in Los Angeles, who was a lot like Ida B. Wells. She walked the streets and talked to gang members when they had the Zoot Suit riots. And she was the only newspaper in California that spoke out against the Japanese encampment and disenfranchising the Japanese community. She ran that in her paper, and she ended up being the first black woman to run for vice president on a national ballot. And of course, you've never heard of her because they didn't win, but she said it didn't matter that we didn't win. We brought our story to the public. So those are some of the she's not living now, but those are some of the people who followed in that investigative journalistic realm. I also think about the journalists that have been killed covering these wars in Israel, in Russia, in South America, in Asia, risking their lives so that we can know what's happening and the courage that they have. Just, yeah, Yes.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Just a point of information, Canton, Ohio, one of their elementary schools is Ida B. Wells, and it's
Is
been there
it?
forever, because, I mean, I'm
I did not
76.
know that.
Yes.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful.
Thank
Well,
you. Thank you very much, Sherry.
Oh.
Thank you.
Home for me, I am a native Clevelander. I lived there for 63 years, and then I met my husband and moved to North Carolina, to Raleigh. But this is home. Yeah, thank you. Thank you all so much. Thank you. Yes, ma'am. Oh, thank you.